What were penny newspapers?
Although the number of newspapers published in the United States climbed quickly during the first decades of the new republic, the decades following independence. 1783, they were not generally accessible to the common man. Priced at an average 6 cents a copy, the cost was outside the reach of the average American. The labor-saving machinery developed during the Industrial Revolution. Late 1700s and early 1800s, was instrumental in lowering the cost of the newspaper. Because production costs were lower, publishers could charge less per copy. The first so-called penny newspaper, or 1-cent paper, was published by Benjamin H. Day, 1810 to 1889. The debut issue of the daily The New York Sun appeared in 1833. The American newspaper industry was off and running. Now reaching a mass audience, publishers worked feverishly to outdo each in order to keep their readers. By the late 1800s, news reporting had become increasingly sensationalistic. Population growth, spurred by increased immigration at the end of the 19th century and early in the 20th century, meant there were plenty of readers for the now thousands of newspapers. During the first decade of the 1900s, before the proliferation of radio, invented 1895, the number of American newspapers peaked at about 2,600 dailies and 14,000 weeklies.
Why is the exodus from Egypt so well known?
The exodus of the Jews from Egypt, an event recorded in the Bible and corroborated by historical evidence, is well known to Jews and non-Jews alike, since the event, which Jews commemorate with Passover, came to symbolize departure from oppressive conditions, for the Israelites had been enslaved in Egypt. According to the Bible, the Old Testament books of Genesis and Exodus, the ancestors of the Israelites had settled in the Nile River delta of Egypt 430 years before the Exodus, or about the 17th century BC. A change of dynasty caused the Israelites, because of their growing numbers, to be looked upon with hostility. They were put to work as state serfs in the construction of cities. The biblical account tells about a series of confrontations between Ramses II, the Pharaoh of Egypt, and the prophet Moses, who had been commissioned by God to lead his people to the promised land. The Pharaoh refused to allow the Israelites to leave Egypt but was later convinced, through a series of divine signs including the 10 plagues, to permit them to go. The flight from Egypt and the promised land have come to symbolize freedom and the realization of hopes.
How extensive were George Washington Carver's agricultural discoveries?
American botanist and agricultural chemist George Washington Carver, c. 1864 to 1943, won international fame for his research. which included finding more than 300 uses for peanuts and more than 100 uses for sweet potatoes. The son of slave parents, Carver was born near Diamond Grove, Missouri, and through his own efforts obtained an education. Earning a bachelor's degree in 1894 and his Master of Science in Agriculture in 1896 from Iowa State University. That year he joined the faculty of Alabama's Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University, where he served as Director of Agricultural Research until his death in 1943. His first research projects centered on soil conservation and agricultural practices. Carver gave lectures and made demonstrations to Southern farmers, particularly black farmers, to help them increase crop production. He then turned his attention to finding new uses for two Southern staple crops, peanuts and sweet potatoes. Carver found that peanuts could be used to make a milk substitute, printer's ink, and soap. He also found new uses for soybeans and devised products that could be made from cotton waste. His efforts were all intended to improve the economy in the American South and better the way of life of Southern black farmers. Carver was lauded for his accomplishments. He was named a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts of London. 1916, he was awarded the Spingarn Medal for Distinguished Service in Agricultural Chemistry, 1923. And he was bestowed with the Theodore Roosevelt Medal for his valuable contributions to science, 1939.
Who invented the telephone?
For more than 100 years Alexander Graham Bell, 1847 to 1922, was credited with inventing the telephone. But in 2002 the U.S. Congress officially recognized a previously unknown Italian-American inventor, Antonio Musi, 1808 to 1889, as the father of the telephone. Musi was born in Florence, Italy, and arrived in the United States in 1845. His focus was the use of electricity in medicine. But in carrying out his experiments, he realized that the voice could be transmitted over wire. By 1862 he had developed dozens of models of his invention, but could not afford to protect his prototypes with patents. In 1870 illness forced the poor inventor to sell his early models. By 1874 he had assembled new models, which he gave to an executive at Western Union Telegraph Company. 2 years later, the announcement was made that Scottish-born inventor Alexander Graham Bell had pioneered the technology. Bell came to the United States in 1871 as a teacher of speech to the deaf. He believed that sound wave vibrations could be converted into electric current at one end of a circuit, and the current could be reconverted into identical sound waves at the other end of the circuit. He had described this idea to his father as early as 1874, and some believe that he may have conceived of it as early as 1865. Still, Musi's prototypes would have predated these ideas. On June 3, 1875, while trying to perfect a method for simultaneously carrying more than 2 messages over a single telegraph line. Bell heard the sound of a pluck spring along 60 feet of wire. In 1876 the first voice transmission via wire was made when Bell had a laboratory accident and called out to his assistant. "Watson, please come here. I want you. Thomas Watson." 1854 to 1934, was on another floor of the building, with the receiving apparatus, and distinctly heard Bell's message. That same year, the Bell telephone was patented in the United States and exhibited at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition. Mussey died in poverty in 1889. His recognition as the father of telephony was the result of persistence on the part of Italian Americans who wished to set the record straight. In fact, in 1871, 5 years earlier than Bell's first voice communication, Mussey had secured a certificate stating his paternity to the invention of the telephone, which he called the teletrophone.
What is the Hegelian dialectic?
It is the system of reasoning put forth by German philosopher George Hegel, 1770–1831, who theorized that at the center of the universe there is an absolute spirit that guides all reality. According to Hegel, all historical developments follow 3 basic laws: each event follows a necessary course. In other words, it could not have happened in any other way. Each historical event represents not only change but progress, and one historical event, or phase, tends to be replaced by its opposite, which is later replaced by a resolution of the 2 extremes. This third law of Hegel's dialectic is the pendulum theory discussed by scholars and students of history. That events swing from one extreme to the other before the pendulum comes to rest at middle. The extreme phases are called the thesis and the antithesis, the resolution is called the synthesis. Based on this system, Hegel asserted that human beings can comprehend the unfolding of history. In this way, he viewed the human experience as absolute and knowable.
What did Alfred Nobel do?
The Swedish chemist whose name is known around the world because of the Nobel Prize, invented dynamite, 1866. Even though dynamite improved the safety of explosives, Alfred Nobel, 1833 to 1896, became concerned with how his invention would be used. Nobel was a pacifist. He was involved in the explosives industry because it was his family's business. In his will, he set up a fund, bequeathing a sum of $9.2 million to reward people who make strides in the sciences, literature, and promoting international peace. He died in 1896, and the Nobel Prize has been awarded annually, except for 1940–42, since 1901. Recipients in any of 5 categories: physics, chemistry, medicine/physiology, literature, and peace are presented with a gold medal, a diploma, and a substantial monetary award. In the hundreds of thousands of US dollars for each laureate. A sixth related award is the prize in economic sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel, which was established in 1968 by the Swedish National Bank and was first awarded in 1969. The laureates are announced each year in October, and the prizes are handed out in ceremonies on December 10, the anniversary of Nobel's death.
What was the reconstruction?
The Reconstruction was the 12-year period, 1865 to 77, of rebuilding that followed the Civil War. The last battle over, the South lay in ruins, food and other supplies were scarce, people were homeless. City centers had been destroyed, schools were demolished, railways torn up, and government was non-existent. Further, the nation had new citizens to enfranchise and protect the freed slaves. There was also the question of how to readmit each Southern state to the Union. In short, the nation's wounds needed to heal. But the long years of the Reconstruction brought only more divisiveness and quarrels. This time the battlefield was not Gettysburg or Chattanooga, but Washington. D.C. President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, a Southern Democrat and former slave owner, squared off with Congress, led by a radical Republican faction. The two branches of government fought over who should guide Reconstruction policy. Johnson favored a more tolerant and swifter approach to reuniting the nation. But his measures failed to protect the country's black citizens. Congress proceeded more cautiously, setting up military administrators in the South as an interim form of government until readmission of the states could be effected. In the end, Congress won out by overriding President Johnson's vetoes again and again. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which took a first step toward enfranchising the black population by guaranteeing the legal rights of former slaves, the Reconstruction Acts, 1867. Outlining how each Southern state would be readmitted to the Union, the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, which extended the life of the wartime agency in order to help Southern blacks and whites get back on their feet, and adopted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the so-called Civil War Amendments. Since the South was based on agriculture, the economy slowly recovered, eventually becoming more industrial. Public schools were established in each state, and the state governments became more open than they had been, with more offices up for election rather than appointment. In addition, blacks were guaranteed the vote and the right to run for office. But there was resistance to all these measures, and the post-Civil War recovery was not smooth. Many historians believe that the controversy that ensued in the years that followed the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, April 1865, laid the groundwork for segregation and other injustices that brought on the civil rights movement. Many also believe that the problems are still with the country today.
Were any 9/11's conspirators convicted?
Yes, but by 2005 there had been only one. French citizen Zacharias Moussaoui, 1968, was convicted in a U.S. court in Alexandria, Virginia. In connection with the September 11, 2001, attacks that claimed nearly 3,000 lives. Moussaoui was taken into custody by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. In August 2001, a flight instructor in Minnesota, where he was training, had reported him as suspicious. After the September terrorist attacks, Moussaoui continued to be held as the possible 20th hijacker. One of the flights on September 11 had 4 hijackers, the other 3 flights each had 5. For the next 3 years, the suspected terrorist was the subject of a sometimes dramatic legal battle. Moussaoui insulted the U.S. district judge hearing his case, attempted to fire his lawyers, and pleaded guilty only to later change his mind. On April 22, 2005, the case came to close when Moussaoui admitted his guilt in front of a packed courtroom. His sentencing trial was set for 2006.
How old is the concept of public health?
Public health is an old concept, dating back to when people first began living in communities. Through the ages, governments have shown varying degrees of concern for the public health. The ancient Greeks, and the Romans after them, tried to ensure the health of their citizens by providing a supply of clean water, via aqueducts and pipelines, managing the disposal of waste, and working to control disease by hiring public physicians to treat the sick. These measures may have helped prevent the spread of certain diseases, but epidemics still occurred. After the fall of the Roman Empire, c. 476, Europe's civilizations largely ignored matters of public health. Once disease was introduced to a community, it would spread quickly. Epidemics of leprosy, the plague, cholera, and yellow fever ensued. During the late 1800s, European governments began turning their attention to matters of public health in an effort to control the spread of disease. In the United States, the public health became an official concern when in 1866 a cholera epidemic struck the nation for the 18th consecutive year. It was part of a worldwide epidemic that persisted for 12 years. Though governments set up health facilities, including laboratories for the study of infectious disease. By 1893 another cholera pandemic, widespread epidemic, began. During the 20th century, the measures taken by national governments to safeguard their citizens from health risks have been strengthened by the establishment of regional and local laboratories. public education programs, and the research conducted at universities and other institutions. These combined efforts have made outbreaks of diseases such as diphtheria, dysentery, typhoid fever, and scarlet fever increasingly less common in developed nations. In developing nations, public health officials continue working with international agencies, such as the World Health Organization and other United Nations agencies, to reduce instances and the spread of infectious disease.
What is common law?
It is the system of justice that prevails in Great Britain and the United States, except Louisiana, where the precedents, past decisions, of the courts are used as the basis of the legal system. It is sometimes referred to as customary law since justices consider prevailing practices, customs, in order to arrive at their decisions. In the U.S., Louisiana is the only state where judges do not rely on precedent or custom to decide private cases, they rely on civil law, the letter of the code, and are free to disregard the decisions of similar cases. In all other states, the precedents must be considered. The exception of Louisiana to the prevailing system of common law is explained by its unique history. It was long a French holding, and that influence is still felt. In many countries, the justice system is a combination of the civil law handed down by the Romans under Justinian and the common law formulated in England. Private cases, often and confusingly called civil cases, are largely the realm of civil law. In other words, the statutes prevail, whereas criminal cases, in which crimes have been committed against society, are the realm of common law, i.e., decisions are based on precedent.
But after nearly 2 decades of accepting the status quo, Friedan asked the question: if women could successfully hold jobs, why shouldn't they?
Assessing their happiness, many women opted to pursue work outside the home. The modern women's movement had begun. Soon women were organizing to promote social and political reforms to do away with discrimination in the workplace and eliminate barriers to entry in education and politics. Friedan herself helped found the National Organization for Women, NOW, in 1966. The association grew rapidly and continues to fight for women's equality in the 21st century.
Who was Montezuma?
Montezuma, or Moctezuma, was the name of 2 rulers of the Aztec Indians in Mexico. Montezuma I ruled an area that extended from the Atlantic to the Pacific. He is credited with enlarging Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, which is today Mexico City. He died in 1469, but 3 years earlier was succeeded by his nephew, Montezuma II, 1466 to 1520. Who is the Montezuma most people are familiar with, since it was during his reign that the Aztecs came into contact with and were eventually conquered by the Spaniards under explorer Hernán Cortés, 1485 to 1547. In 1519 Montezuma tried to persuade Cortés not to come to Mexico City. But Cortés and his troops marched inland anyway. The Aztecs rose up to fight the Spaniards, but Montezuma was wounded as he addressed his warriors. He died a few days later, on June 30, 1520, 1 year before Mexico City fell to the Spaniards.
What happened in the blackout of 2003?
A 3-month investigation found that line failures and system errors combined to cause the power outage that hit much of the Northeast and Great Lakes portions of the United States, as well as parts of eastern Canada. On August 14, 2003, the blackout affected 50 million people, 40 million of them in the United States. A task force headed by the U.S. Department of Energy and its Canadian counterparts delved into the sequence of events that caused the massive power failure. Investigators concluded that mistakes made by First Energy Corporation of Akron, Ohio, had combined with heavy loads of power to stress the interstate electrical grid and cause its failure through a chain reaction. Just after 4 p.m. EDT. On Friday, August 14, power was knocked out from Detroit to Toronto to New York City. The widespread outage immediately affected water supplies, halted air transportation and subway systems, snarled ground transportation, and brought most distribution lines to a standstill, affecting the flow of food and other supplies. Though there were isolated reports of looting, crime was minimal, with New York City reporting a lower crime rate for the night of August 14 than usual. 8 deaths were related to the blackout. Power began to be restored to some areas later that evening, but it was August 16 before all affected areas were back online. 2 weeks later, on August 28, London experienced a blackout at the peak of evening rush hour. The outage paralyzed the British capital and left 500,000 commuters stranded. Power was restored within an hour. A utilities official said that the freak event was caused by 2 faults that happened in quick succession. In late September 2003 there were also widespread power outages in Denmark, Sweden, and Italy. The blackout in Italy affected the entire nation, with the exception of Sardinia, or 57 million people. Because it happened overnight and on a weekend, the impact was minimal. The blackouts drew attention to the need for system upgrades, improved maintenance, and more sophisticated alert systems to prevent such grid failures, which take both an economic and human toll.
Who developed printing?
if printing is defined as the process of transferring repeatable designs onto a surface. Then the first known printing was done by the Mesopotamians, who as early as 3000 BC used stamps to impress designs onto wet clay. Printing on paper developed much later. Chinese inventor Tizhe Ailun AD-C 50-C 118, is credited with producing the first paper in AD 105. During the Tiang dynasty. 618 to 906, Chinese books were printed with inked wood blocks, and it was the Chinese not German printer Johannes Gutenberg, c. 1390 to 1468, as is widely believed, who developed movable type, allowing printers to compose a master page from permanent, raised characters. However, movable type printing did not catch on in medieval China because the Chinese language has some 80,000 characters. Printers found it more convenient to use carved blocks.
When was photography invented?
The concept of still photography dates back to the 10th century when Islamic scientists developed the camera obscura. Latin for dark chamber, a darkened enclosure with a small aperture, opening, to admit light. The light rays would cast an inverted image of external objects onto a flat surface opposite the aperture. This image could be studied and traced by someone working inside the camera obscura. Or the image could be viewed from the outside of the camera, through a peephole. In the 16th century, the Italian scientist Giambattista della Porta, c. 1535 to 1615, published his studies on fitting the aperture of the camera obscura with a lens to strengthen or enlarge the image projected. Made increasingly versatile through additional improvements, the camera obscura became popular among 17th and 18th century European artists. But the camera obscura could only project, rather than reproduce, images onto a screen or a piece of paper. During the 1800s, scientists experimented with ways of making the images permanent. Among those who made advances in the photographic process were French physicist Joseph Nicéphore Niepce. 1765 to 1833, who produced the first negative image in 1826, French painter Louis-Jacques Daguerre. 1759 to 1851, who in 1839 succeeded in making a direct positive image on a silver plate. Known as the daguerreotype, English scientist William Henry Fox Talbot, 1800 to 1877, who developed a paper negative, c. 1841, that could be used to print any number of paper positives, and English astronomer Sir John Herschel. 1792 to 1891, who was the first to produce a practical photographic fixing agent and the first to apply the terms positive and negative to photographic images. All of these milestones made photography a practical way of permanently recording real-life images. The breakthrough in still photography was the Kodak. Introduced in 1888 by American inventor George Eastman, 1854 to 1932. The Kodak camera used film that was wound on rollers. eliminating the glass photographic plates that had been in use. The box-shaped camera made photography accessible to everyone, including amateurs. By the early 1900s, the Eastman Kodak Company had become the largest photographic film and camera producer in the world. George Eastman has been credited with mass-producing the moment, before the Kodak. A word he made up because he was fond of the letter K. Photography had largely been the domain of professionals who were commissioned to take portraits of the well-to-do prominent members of society. Once the Kodak became widely available, photographs preserved the faces of ordinary people and the events of everyday life.
What was vaudeville?
Light, comical theatrical entertainment. Vaudeville flourished at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. Programs combined a variety of music, theater, and comedy to appeal to a wide audience. Script writers attracted immigrant audiences by using ethnic humor, exaggerating dialects, and joking about the difficulties of daily immigrant life in America. The word vaudeville is derived from an Old French term for a satirical song. Vaudeville, which is a reference to the Var Valley of France, where the songs originated. Vaudeville made its way to the American stage by the 1870s. When acts performed in theaters in New York, Chicago, and other cities. Troupes traveled a circuit of nearly 1,000 theaters around the country. As many as 2 million Americans a day flocked to the shows to see headliners such as comedians Eddie Cantor, 1892 to 1964, and W.C. Fields, 1880 to 1946. Singer Eva Tanguay, 1878 to 1947, and French actress Sarah Bernhardt, 1844 to 1923. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, vaudeville was the most popular form of entertainment in the country. In the 1930s, just as New York opened the doors of its famous Radio City Music Hall, which was intended to be a theater for vaudeville, the entertainment form began a quick decline. Motion pictures, radio, and, later, television took its place, with numerous vaudeville performers parlaying their success into these new media. Among those entertainers who had their origins in vaudeville acts were actors Rudolph Valentino, Cary Grant, Mae West, Jack Benny, George Burns, Gracie Allen, Ginger Rogers, Fred Astaire, Will Rogers, and Al Jolson.
Who was more important to rock and roll, Elvis Presley or the Beatles?
While music historians and fans of either or both may be willing to offer an opinion, the question cannot be definitively answered. The fact is that popular music today would not be what it is had it not been for both Elvis Presley and the Beatles. And the influences of both are still felt. Elvis Presley, 1935 to 1977, brought to music an exciting and fresh combination of country, gospel, blues, and rhythm and blues music, and topped it all off with a style and sense of showmanship that dazzled young audiences. His first commercial recording was That's All Right, Mama in 1954, which was followed in 1956 by the success of Heartbreak Hotel. Between 1956 and 1969 he had 17 #1 records. Presley defined a new musical style and an era. Among those the American Presley had influenced were four English musicians who called themselves the Beatles. Originally founded as the Quarrymen by John Lennon, 1940 to 1980, in 1956. The group became the most popular rock and roll band of the 1960s. Their first single was Love Me Do, released on October 5, 1962, and producer George Martin was encouraged that the Beatles could produce a #1 record. In 1963 they did. Please Please Me was released in Britain on January 12 and was an immediate hit. Other hits off their first album included She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand. The follow-up album, With the Beatles, was released in 1964 and established them as Britain's favorite group. Already popular in their homeland, Beatlemania began in the United States on February 7, 1964, when the mop-topped Fab Four, Lennon along with Paul McCartney, b. 1942, George Harrison, 1943 to 2001, and Ringo Starr, b. 1940, arrived at New York's Kennedy International Airport and were met by a mob of more than 10,000 screaming fans and 110 police officers. 2 days later, on February 9, the Beatles made their legendary appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. By April the group held onto the top 5 positions on the US singles charts. The British invasion had begun. In their early years, the Beatles brought a new energy to rock and roll and picked up where Presley, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard had left off. The instrumentation and orchestration of Beatles songs, for which their producer George Martin deserves at least some of the credit, were innovative at the time, and are common for rock music today. Their rock movies, A Hard Day's Night, 1964, and Help, 1965, were a precursor to the music videos of today. When the band decided to break up, the April 10, 1970, announcement proved to be the end of an era.
Who were the Whigs?
They were members of political parties in Scotland, England, and the United States. The name is derived from Whig gamer, meaning cattle driver, which was a derogatory term used in the 17th century to refer to Scottish Presbyterians who opposed King Charles I of England, 1600 to 1649. Charles, who ruled from 1625 to 1649, was deposed in a civil war and subsequently tried in court. convicted of treason, and beheaded. The British Whigs, who were mostly merchants and landed gentry, supported a strong parliament. They were opposed by the aristocratic Tories who upheld the power of the king. For a short period during the 18th century, the Whigs dominated political life in England. After 1832 they became part of the Liberal Party. At about the same time, the Whig Party in the United States emerged as one of the two major American political parties. The other was the Democratic Party that Americans still know today, which supported President Andrew Jackson. 1767 to 1845, for re-election in 1832. Though Jackson's first term of office had proved to be somewhat controversial, the Whigs were unable to elect their candidate, Henry Clay. 1777 to 1852, of the so-called Southern Cotton Whigs, and Jackson, called Old Hickory, went on to a second term. In the election of 1840 the Whigs, whose leadership had succeeded in uniting the party, were finally successful in putting their candidate in the White House. But William Henry Harrison, 1773 to 1841, died after only 32 days in office, and his successor, John Tyler, 1790 to 1862, alienated the Whig leaders in Congress, and they ousted him from the party. In 1848 the Whigs put Zachary Taylor, nicknamed Old Rough and Ready, 1784 to 1850, in the White House, but 2 years later he, too, died in office. His successor, Millard Fillmore, 1800 to 1874, remained loyal to the Whigs, but there were problems within the party. The last Whig presidential candidate was General Winfield Scott, Old Fuss and Feathers. 1786 to 1866, in 1852, but he was defeated by Franklin Pierce, 1804 to 1869. Shortly thereafter the Whig Party broke up over the slavery issue. Most of the Northern Whigs joined the Republican Party, while most of the Southern Cotton Whigs joined the Democratic Party.
When were schools in the United States desegregated?
On May 17, 1954, in the case of Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled, 9-0, that racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. The court overturned the separate but equal doctrine laid down in the 1896 case. Plessy v. Ferguson. Chief Justice Earl Warren, 1891-1974. Ordered the states to proceed with all deliberate speed to integrate educational facilities. Also in 1954, on November 7, the Supreme Court ordered desegregation of public golf courses, parks, swimming pools, and playgrounds. In the aftermath of these rulings, desegregation proceeded slowly and painfully. In the early 1960s sit-ins, freedom rides, and similar expressions of nonviolent resistance by blacks and their sympathizers led to a decrease in segregation practices in public facilities. How has the U.S.
Were the Vikings the first Europeans to reach North America?
It is believed that the seafaring Norsemen, who are alternately called the Vikings, were in fact the first Europeans to see the Western Hemisphere, North and South America and the surrounding waters. Norwegian-born Leif Erikson, c. 970 c. 1020. Is generally credited with having been the first European to set foot on North American soil. Erikson was the son of navigator Eric the Red, who founded a Norse settlement in Greenland and moved his family there in 985 or 986. About that same time another Norseman, Bjarni Herjolfsson, who was driven off course on his way from Iceland to Greenland, became the first European to sight North America, but he did not go ashore. It is believed that Erikson decided he would follow up on Herjolfsson's discovery. About 1001 Erikson set out from Greenland with a crew of 35 men and probably landed on the southern end of Baffin Island, due north of the province of Quebec. The expedition likely made it to Labrador, Newfoundland, on the northeastern North American mainland, and later landed on the coast of what is today Nova Scotia or Newfoundland, Canada. This landfall may have been at Lance Auxiliary Meadows, on Newfoundland Island. Erikson and his crew spent the winter of 1001-02 at a place he called Vinland, which was described as well wooded and produced fruit, especially grapes. He returned to Greenland in the spring of 1002. The first authenticated European landing in North America was in 1500 when Portuguese navigator Gaspar de Corte Real, c. 1450 c. 1501, explored the coast of Labrador and Newfoundland. A year later, he made a second trip to North America but never returned home. In 1502 his brother Miguel went out in search of him, neither returned.
What were carpetbaggers?
Carpetbaggers was a derisive term that referred to northerners who arrived in the South in the early days of Reconstruction. 1865 to 77, the 12-year period of rebuilding that followed the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. Even though many of these northern businessmen intended to settle in the South, Southerners viewed them as outsiders and, worse, as opportunists who only intended to make a quick profit before returning north. They were called carpetbaggers because many carried carpetbags as luggage. Some Southerners even quipped that these Northerners could carry all their belongings in a carpetbag, implying that they were nothing more than transients. Nevertheless, Northerners who relocated to the South following the Civil War played an important role during Reconstruction. Some, aided by the black vote, gained public office and impacted state and local policy. but others proved to be corrupt. Because of the latter, the term carpetbagger became synonymous with a meddling, opportunistic outsider.
Is bluegrass music a distinctly American genre?
Yes, the style of music developed out of country music during the late 1930s and throughout the 1940s. Bill Monroe, 1911 to 1996, a country and bluegrass singer-songwriter, altered the tempo, key, pitch, and instrumentation of traditional country music to create a new style named for the band that originated it. Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys. Monroe's home state was Kentucky. Bluegrass was first heard by a wide audience when in October 1939. Monroe and his band appeared on the popular country music radio program The Grand Ole Opry. Although bluegrass evolved through several stages and involved a host of contributors, through it all Bill Monroe remained the guiding and inspirational force, and therefore merits the distinction of being the father of bluegrass.
What is Al-Qaeda?
Al-Qaeda, Arabic, meaning the base, is a global network of terrorists who banded together during the 1990s and proclaimed to be carrying out a holy war on non-Islamic nations. The group knows no national boundaries, though certain nations, including Afghanistan, were known to be Al-Qaeda strongholds. Led by the elusive Osama bin Laden, 1957, a wealthy exiled Saudi, the group conducted terrorist training programs in several Muslim, mostly Middle Eastern, countries and was funded by loyalists around the world. One of the United States' first actions following the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, which were later confirmed to have been carried out by Al-Qaeda operatives, was to freeze bank accounts of persons and organizations with suspected ties to the terrorist group. The roots of Al-Qaeda can be traced to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, when thousands of Muslims, including bin Laden, joined the Afghan resistance. The 10-year conflict was a rallying point for Islamic extremists. Bin Laden returned home to Saudi Arabia in 1989, determined to perpetuate a holy war, jihad, by maintaining the funding, organization, and training that had made the Afghan resistance victorious against the Soviets. By the early 1990s he emerged as a leader in the Muslim world, proclaiming his goal to reinstate the Caliphate, a unified Muslim state. He also proclaimed the United States to be an enemy to Islam. He considered the nation responsible for all conflicts involving Muslims. The Saudi government rescinded his passport in 1994, and bin Laden fled his homeland. He eventually found safe harbor in Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. According to the report issued by the 9/11 Commission, bin Laden's declaration of war came in February 1998. when he and fugitive Egyptian physician Ayman al-Zawahiri arranged from their Afghanistan headquarters for an Arabic newspaper in London to publish what they termed a fatwa issued in the name of a World Islamic Front. The statement claimed that America had declared war against God and his messenger, and they called for retaliation. Under bin Laden's direction, Al-Qaeda carried out several attacks on American targets, including the August 7, 1998, bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, which killed 258 and injured 5,000, and the September 11, 2001, attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, which killed nearly 3,000 people. After the Global Coalition Against Terrorism, led by U.S. forces, launched its attack on Afghanistan in October 2001, bin Laden was believed to have fled for Pakistan. Capturing him and other Al-Qaeda leaders and operatives was the key objective of the United States in its efforts to dismantle the terrorist network.
What was trial by ordeal?
It was an irrational way of determining someone's guilt or innocence. After the fall of Rome, 476, Roman law gave way to the laws of the various Germanic, also called barbarian, tribes in Europe. If someone was charged with a crime, he or she was deliberately injured in some way. If the injury, from a heated iron bar or immersion into hot water, for example, healed within a prescribed number of days, usually 3, the person was declared innocent. If the wound failed to heal, the verdict was guilty. This method for determining innocence or guilt was also called divination, since the court was trying, through the ordeal, to divine, discover intuitively, whether the accused person was guilty. Trial by ordeal gave way to a far more practical, and certainly more rational, form of trial, in which judge and jury presided over the presentation of a case and employed written code or precedent or both to arrive at a verdict. But divination, literally, to predict by supernatural means, was used as recently as the 1600s. When women in Puritan New England were charged with witchcraft, a suspect was bound up with rope and immersed in water. If she sank, she was innocent; if she floated, she was declared guilty. The reasoning being that only someone with supernatural power could float under the circumstances. Those found guilty by this form of trial were put to death.
Supreme Court decided.
Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, 1788, states that the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court. It goes on to describe the High Court's jurisdiction, but it does not specify how the court was to be formed or how many justices it would consist of. These matters were left to Congress, which in 1788, the year the Constitution was ratified, passed the first Judiciary Act, formulating the court's original organization. It had just 6 members, the Chief Justice, plus 5 associates. Subsequent congressional acts have modified the Supreme Court's organization and jurisdiction. Since 1869 the court has consisted of 9 members. The Chief Justice and 8 associates who, once named, serve for life. Justices are appointed by the President but must be approved by the Senate. According to Article 2 of the Constitution, to avoid partisanship, Congress is prevented from lowering the salaries of any of the justices, and justices can only be removed from the bench by impeachment. A formal document that charges a public official with misconduct. Cases reach the High Court through appeal, lower court decisions that are formally challenged, and the justices make their rulings based on a majority vote. Who was the first Chief Justice of the U.S.?
When was the Wall Street Journal first published?
The newspaper, considered one of the world's best and certainly the preeminent American financial periodical, was first published in 1889, 7 years after the Dow Jones and Company. The comma between the two names was later dropped. Was founded by financial reporters Charles Henry Dow, 1851–1902, and Edward Davis Jones, 1856–1920. Since the founding of the New York Stock Exchange, NYSE, in 1792, business reporting had been largely based on rumor or speculation. Dow and Jones were determined to provide American businesspeople and investors with up-to-date and accurate reporting on the stock market. In its first 7 years of business, their publishing company grew from 6 employees to a staff of 50. In 1889 Dow and Jones expanded their 2-page daily newspaper, titled Customer's Afternoon Letter, into the Wall Street Journal. The paper's stated goal was to give full and fair information regarding fluctuations in the prices of stocks, bonds, and some commodities. Further, the focus was to be on news rather than opinion. The paper began publishing composite lists of major stocks in 1884. In the decades since, it has expanded coverage to include all facets of the business and economic world and now caters to the leisure interests of business people by publishing reports on the arts, travel, sports, and other recreational activities.
What is the world's tallest building?
The honor belongs, at least for a time, to Taipei 101, also known as Taipei Financial Center, in Taiwan. The soaring spire, which rises to a height of 1,670 feet and includes 101 stories, was completed in 2004, besting Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia's twin Petronas Towers, completed in 1998, which measure 1,483 feet and 88 stories. For 6 years, the Petronas laid claim to the title of world's tallest building. The next tallest is the Sears Tower, completed in 1974, which rises 1,450 feet and 110 stories above Chicago's sidewalks. For a time, it, too, was the world's tallest. The skyscraper is a decidedly American contribution to world architecture. When Chicago rebuilt following the Great Fire of October 1871, a new brand of architecture emerged, which focused on commercial buildings. Architects of the so-called Chicago School used new building materials and the innovative elevator, first patented by Elisha Otis in 1861, to construct vertical office buildings, making the most of city real estate. Though many designers worked on the form, engineer/architect William Jenney, 1832 to 1907, is called the father of the skyscraper. His home insurance building, completed in 1885, it was demolished in 1931. Rose to 10 stories and used mass-produced steel beams, cast iron, and wrought iron with masonry walls. Soon Chicago's and New York's skylines were punctuated by rising towers. By the end of the 19th century, the race for tallest was on. New York's Park Row building, which still stands today in Lower Manhattan, was completed in 1899 and rises to a height of 386 feet and 30 stories. The 20th century saw the skyscraper reach ever upward. For a short time, the title of world's tallest building was held by Manhattan's celebrated Chrysler Building, completed in 1930, considered the height of Art Deco design. The Chrysler's 1,046 feet and 77 stories of glory were soon bettered by the Empire State Building, completed in 1931, which boasts a total height of 1,224 feet and 102 stories. That New York City landmark held onto its position for 4 decades, becoming second tallest with the 1973 completion of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, which soared to 1,368 and 1,362 feet, and 110 stories each, before they fell in the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Despite the fear that skyscrapers, bold symbols of capitalism, could become targets for other terrorist strikes, architects and developers continued to reach skyward, assuring that Taipei 101 would be surpassed.
Was the Madrid commuter train bombing an act of terrorism?
Spanish officials concluded that the March 11, 2004, bombing of packed commuter trains in Madrid was an act of terrorism, likely motivated by Spain's arrest of dozens of al-Qaeda suspects after the September 11, 2001, attacks on the United States. At least 3 of those arrested in Spain were charged with helping organize the 9/11 attacks. On March 11, 2004, 10 backpacks loaded with dynamite exploded on 4 trains at the height of morning rush hour. killing 191 people and injuring 1,800. In the investigation that followed, officials uncovered other terrorist plots, including suicide bombings and assassinations aimed at interrupting Spain's court system that tries terrorist suspects. The discoveries led officials to conclude that their nation had become a crossroads for Muslim extremists, in part because of Spain's proximity to northern Africa. In April 2004, as authorities closed in on the hideout of the suspected Madrid bombing ringleader, a Tunisian man, and his associates, the suspects blew up their apartment. A total of 62 suspects were arrested in 2004 in association with the train bombing.
How did World War II begin?
The war began on September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, which was soon crushed by German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler's 1889–1945 war machine. But while the Nazis moved in from the west, Poland was under attack by the Soviets from the north and east. The events in the Eastern European country had set the stage for a major conflict. After Poland, the Germans moved into Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and France, taking control as they went. By June 1940 only Great Britain stood against Hitler, who was joined by Axis power Italy. Before long, fighting had spread into Greece and northern Africa. In June 1941 Germany invaded the Soviet Union, enlarging the scope of the conflict again. With the world's focus on war-torn Europe, Japan executed a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in December 1941, which drew Americans into the war. The war would not end until 1945.
Why was the Titanic thought to be unsinkable?
The RMS Titanic was state-of-the-art, a huge and luxurious ocean liner equipped with the latest and best. The ship's size afforded it great stability, its structure included more steel than had been used in previous ships. It was built with a double bottom. Both skins were heavier and thicker than those of other ships. The hull was divided by 15 bulkheads, upright partitions, that rose 5 decks forward and aft, back, and 4 decks midship. These transverse bulkheads divided the ship into 16 compartments watertight, chambers any two of which could take on water without sinking the ship. This marvel of modern technology, which was to be the jewel in the crown of the White Star Line, was given a fitting name. Titanic is a Greek word meaning having great force or power, and it was described as practically unsinkable. However, the ship designer did not and could not prepare the ship for what happened on the night of April 14, 1912. Just before midnight, the Titanic was speeding at 21 knots through the North Atlantic. Even though the crew had been warned by other ships that the unusually calm waters were full of ice, when the Titanic's two watchmen, who were not using binoculars, sighted an iceberg in the ship's path. It was only a quarter-mile away. The ship was turned to the port, left, but it was too late. The underwater shelf of the ice tore through the plating on the starboard, right, side of the ship. Thin slits developed at the seams in the ship's hull, allowing seawater to enter. The effect was similar to filling an ice tray with water, once one watertight chamber had filled. The rushing water spilled over the top and into the next. Titanic came to symbolize human arrogance. The ship owners and operators believed the Titanic was impervious to nature. Consequently, the ocean liner had not been equipped with the number of lifeboats needed to rescue everyone on board. Titanic's lifeboats had room for about half the passengers. Since there had been no safety drills on board, many lifeboats were launched only half full. The enormous loss of life, which included society's most prominent individuals as well as ordinary families who were immigrating to America, stands out as one of the great tragedies in the history of transportation.